Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Expert Talks Online. I'm Kev Gray, Partnership Lead for Equal Experts, and I'll be chairing tonight. So the meeting's due for 60 minutes maximum. We've got two great talks tonight, and that'll be followed by a sort of 20-minute Q&A at the end. If we sort of get to a point where there's no more questions, we'll finish early, but I assume we'll probably take the full sort of hour. So for housekeeping, feel free to ask any questions via the Q&A channel. However, if you have any burning questions, just raise your hand and someone will let you in to sort of ask a question at any point. I've checked with both Martin and Werner and they're happy with this. And just so you know, we'll be recording the session and we'll be sort of sharing it in a few days if you want to kind of go back over it. So tonight we'll be discussing web forms and looking at the sort of infamous build versus buy debate. To do this, we have two experts in the field. First up is Werner Schmidt. He's one of our senior associates from our South African operations, who has a background in survey tooling, development platforms, and data collection solutions. As a CTO of a previous web form solution company, he has faced sort of into the build and buy debate on many occasions. Tonight, he'll be covering the key questions he asked himself when deciding to build or buy, and he'll be thinking about how he decides what is the right solution for a client dependent on their needs. Our second speaker is Martin Gladish, who is the MD of UXForms. This is the enterprise-ready cloud platform for web form development that has been used for over 4 years as the front-end solution for the Intellectual Property Office to register trademarks when they moved from a build to buy strategy. So tonight, Martin will be telling us about his experience of developing complex web forms for a government department and giving us a quick demo at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Werner.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I had such a good laugh when Kevin told us that he's starting at 6, and I thought to myself, I'm 2 hours late because I'm in a different time zone. Well, it was a good giggle. I'm going to be sharing screen with you just to give you an idea of what we're doing. We're looking at the concept of whether you should tell a client to build something or to buy something. And in my previous world, there was a couple of questions that I used to ask myself. Not only in consulting with a client, but also in making decisions in other jobs that I've done before. So when I was consulting with clients, it really came down to what is the right thing for them. When I was doing it for my own endeavors, the same rules applied, but it was just focused on me. So it's the same principle. But what it comes down to really is 6 key elements that I like to ask questions around. Do you understand what your core business is, firstly? So when you want to make a decision whether you should build your own form provider or your own survey provider, whatever you want to call it, or whether you should buy or rent one, you really have to ask yourself, what is my core business? And if my core business isn't to be a provider, you really need to start thinking very clearly about whether you should be building something. The reason for this is we also need to understand our problem. Now, if our problem is of such a nature that we need to understand how to best engage with our audience. So where are they located, for example, in the world? What kind of technology backgrounds do they have? We used to call it the LMI, the Lifestyle Measurement Index, and that you use to determine what kind of technology a person is most likely to have. So a lower LMI individual won't have a smartphone. A higher LMI individual will most likely have a smartphone. It's a very common thing used in marketing, but it's super important to understand when you're making a decision on how to host a form, and that directly influences whether you're building or buying something. You need to understand what the ecosystem looks like. So am I activating people individually, or am I activating in a group? Am I doing it personally, or am I doing it on the fly? In other words, it might be a poster somewhere in a building that you scan and you gain access to the form. All of these things combined, you have to start asking questions about exploitability. I know a lot of people don't like the word exploit. That's my wife, by the way. Very lovely lady. Is what I'm trying to do now going to allow me to exploit this in future? So in other words, is there a possibility for this to repeat or to have return business? Can I use it in more than one arena? And the exploitability element of it has always been quite a strong decision-making factor for me when it's a decision to build or rent. Because it's not just the IP that you're putting into a system, it's also the control that you have over that system, which is going to allow you to make that choice and to see whether you can further exploit an opportunity. Not very many people do it, but it is super important. You need to understand what is your risk appetite. Your brand, your reputation, what is the damage? In other words, if I do something, I'm going to start building it and I get clients onboarded and they're all happy and they sign up and this thing isn't done yet, or it's not delivering to spec, it's not delivering to standard, it doesn't have good uptime, it's got errors in it. What is the reputational damage that I'm going to have? Software is software. If it's not correctly built or it's not built with good practices, you're going to end up with issues. When you're actually hosting something, when you are collecting people's information, let's say it's an online booking system, or you're simply trying to figure out who is interested in the new library opening up earlier hours, doesn't really matter what you're doing. What is the impact of failure? And what I mean by that is, what is the kind of data that I'm collecting? Where is this data going? If this goes wrong, if my survey or my form tool stops working in the middle of this process, what happens? Is it a graceful failure? Is it a shutdown? How is that going to affect people's perception? Will I lose engagement because I had a one-time error? What happens to the data is an important one. Where does it go? So if this system fails or it is opened, in other words, it's hacked, where does the information go? And those are all things you need to take into consideration. If you build it, you own it, and you're also responsible for the data. If you rent it, then the responsibility for ensuring the safety of the data in the system sort of shifts a little bit. And that depends on the country you're in and the laws that you're in. But there is that kind of decision to make when you want to ask yourself a question about risk. When you buy something off the shelf or you rent it, now in this case, there's many tools out there. I don't actually know if I can mention names, but I mean the most common one people know is SurveyMonkey. You need to understand that with SurveyMonkey, you get a really good tool, and they're very, very well protected. They're GDPR compliant. They're a really, really good base. But you are limited in what you can do, and for customization, you pay. You pay extra and you pay above. So not every survey is a free survey. And when you're making the choice to build or buy, you really need to ask yourself the question, how much customizability do I want to own? Do I need to be able to white label whatever I'm doing to the degree that nobody knows who's hosting the system and only the client's IP or the client's CI is available? So you never think that you're working with company A on top of SurveyMonkey, or it has to be in that sort of spectrum of customizability. The second one you need to ask yourself is, do I need to introduce things that this tool doesn't offer? Do I need to, for example, introduce a heat map slider to give you an idea of my emotional state on a question? How afraid of you of flying? I would like a heat map slider. Oh, sorry, this tool doesn't have it. So it's that kind of customizability that allows you to engage your audience better. Is limited when you buy or rent, but it's much more open when you build for yourself. And then one that people very often do not necessarily work into the equation is, what is the cost of owning this thing beyond the build? So if I am renting, I have literally zero cost when it comes to actually operating the platform. The platform is owned by someone else. They carry all of that cost. My cost is only coming into effect when I'm either working on the system, trying to process the data, uploading new IP, uploading new CI. That's when I start paying, because it's my staff doing it or it's me doing it. Time is money. It's a very simple thing to do. When you build and you own that infrastructure, there's a couple of other factors that come into play here. Now you have to ask yourself, can I maintain the system and can I maintain a competitive edge in the market? If you track form building tools as closely as I used to, it's absolutely astounding how quickly new elements and new features come to rise. It is absolutely amazing. You have to be so on top of your game to stay in the market. It's not even funny. And you really have to ask yourself the question, do I have the resources and the people to do that? Can I remain competitive? And can I keep up with maintenance? If you have what we used to call a dry month, in other words, there's not as many surveys as we would like to have seen, that means that the cost of operating the platform now is not done out of revenue. It's now done out of a reserve. And that reserve cost sometimes, that runs out, because that's also generated out of revenue. And companies don't always, or people don't always think about the fact that I might need to maintain the system for months on end whilst I don't have the customer base to support my operations. And this is a really important part of deciding whether you want to buy or build. It's the total cost of ownership versus the limited cost of ownership. And that always plays off against how much control do I have, how much customizability do I get, and then obviously, does this thing actually work for the individuals that I'm trying to engage with? One really strange example is there was a survey done on a purpose-built device originally used to measure, I believe it was light. I can't remember exactly what the device was, but somebody had gone and built a piece of software that could run on this purpose-built piece of hardware, because that's the only way they could communicate with these individuals. There was no phones allowed on site. There were no internet connections. This is what they had. They had these devices, and those devices would swap out with each shift. And it was a pretty impressive solution, but it was expensive. It had to be maintained constantly, and it was extremely limited due to where they were trying to build it. That covers the kind of pillars that I use to make decisions. I did take this and expanded it a bit more into a bit of a mind map, and I'm not going to go through every single piece of it. I'm quite certain this thing can be made available afterwards. But when you are looking at helping a client make a decision, or even yourself make a decision, if you're in a consulting space or you want to go into business, there's a couple of really simple questions that help to solve this problem for you. Apart from the 6 pillars, is budget. How much money do you have? How much people do you have available to you? Like, can you actually afford to build and maintain it, or should you just rather rent? Time. This is something that people don't think about. Can you actually, do you have the time to build something in order to meet your engagements? Or do you rather need to rent in order to meet? Because sometimes there's a deadline. There's no way of getting around it. Like 29th of August, we need to go live in 7 countries. Are you going to be able to build a stable platform for that date? Or do you think it might be a better option to start looking at tooling and finding the one that suits that purpose and allows you to meet that revenue stream accurately? And then an important one for me is effort. Effort is a strange thing because it's very subjective. But effort comes down to, do I have the skills in-house? And if I don't have them, can I find them? How much effort is it for me? How much effort is it going to be for me to get this engagement off the ground? Whether I build or whether I buy, do I actually have the focus and the availability to get this thing off the ground? Sometimes, and I got a couple of skew looks from my previous CEO, but eventually we sorted it out. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a client is to consult them out of using your tool. We had quite a few clients who you really just needed to do a text message. That's all you needed to do. You did not need to buy this very expensive system to get done what you needed done. And that for us was always a primary driver, is always do the right thing by the client. And I mean, he has the same value, and that's important to us as well. But it's really something special when you get to tell a client, you know what, you don't actually need this. You can solve it easier. Because the amount of effort that's available to you, you really shouldn't be getting involved in something that is as complex as this. Some of the other elements around this block that I'll just put on screen, and then I'll talk you through them. Hosting, frequency, processing, post-engagement, and integration. Now, these are 5 elements that come with every engagement that you do. It doesn't matter what system or tool you use, these are the things you're going to be facing. Hosting. Who is hosting this thing? Where is it hosted? Is there any legal or regulatory obligations that you need to conform with? Are you allowed to collect certain pieces of information? This stuff is super, super, super important. Frequency. This thing that I'm trying to do, whether it's a survey or collecting information, how often does this happen? Is this something that I'm going to be doing on a weekly basis, on a daily basis? How long is it happening for? So am I doing this for the next 6 months? Is this over a weekend because it's, for example, Super Bowl or it's the FA Cup final? What is the frequency that this is going in? Because again, that frequency will dictate whether you have the time and the budget to do it and how much of that you should be spending on it. Again, that concept of repeatability, and this is where, whether you build or buy, whatever you're trying to do, try and find a way to exploit it. In other words, if I've done a training engagement once on a specific topic, let's say it's health and safety topic, I can most likely reskin or apply new CI to it and train several other companies. So I have a much larger upfront budget and effort investment, but over time it becomes much easier. And for that, I actually need a tool that is giving me the ability to repeat this information and to segment the data, which leads us into processing. Very important part of deciding whether to build or buy is, what is the real-time data processing like? Do I have access to the data in real time? My customer might need to make decisions based on what's happening in real time. Thinking back on my own experiences, we had an engagement with an American sports team, which due to NDAs I can't name, very, very famous sports team. And they needed to have real-time feedback because during halftime, they wanted to run polls and they would like to announce the winner at the end of halftime, which means you have to get that data almost instantaneously. Reporting and consumption is something that should never be overlooked. Can you report? Do you need to process the data in order to make reports? Does the tool that you're using, whether you're building or buying, does it give you reports out of the box? And are they in such a format that your end consumers, in other words, the people interested in this data, will they be able to understand it? Is your audience effectively going to be able to engage with this information? And then the last two are post-engagement and integration. Post-engagement, to me personally, is a super important bit. There's nothing worse than being asked to complete a survey or fill in a form and nothing happens afterwards. No thank you, no message saying we've captured your data, or thank you very much for participating, this was the result. I think to me, it's terrible. I think it should always be done. If you're going to ask people to give you info, at least give them the courtesy of telling them, this is what we've done with it and thanks for participating. And then the last one is integration. And this is it's a hairy one, because now you're asking yourself the question, I want to, for example, build a tool, and this thing is going to primarily be used to run surveys and to run digital training. And then somebody tells you about a thing called Scrum. And you're like, what is Scrum? Well, Scrum is a standard for learning materials. And then you find out that this thing you built isn't Scrum compliant, and now you have to go and rebuild it. Whereas if you, for example, had taken something off the shelf, put your own ideas into it that was already Scrum compliant, this problem would have been gone away immediately for you. Integration is a hairy business. It can be very expensive, and it's super important to think about the potential of integration further down the line. Clients love to integrate with systems like this because they like to own their data. They don't want the data sitting in your data stores. They would like to have copies of it. That brings me actually to the end of it. So if there are any questions, we'll catch them in the question bar, and I think we will answer them afterwards. I am going to hand over to Martin. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Werner. So that ties in quite nicely. So unfortunately, I don't have the shiny slides to match that, but it does lead in quite nicely for the sorts of things that we've led into UXForms. So similar experiences, similar backgrounds of having to work on systems that capture user data or capture information from end users over the years in all sorts of different shapes and flavors. Sometimes it's not even sort of dedicated forms or surveys. So for instance, it's things like not even apply. So applying for things is one of the classic examples. So applying for a passport, that's a user journey that we can all understand, and that feels very formy. That feels like a form. Other things that are much more embedded into sort of almost applications or services are things like previous lives when working for a scientific publisher. So authors need to come in and submit their manuscripts for potential publication or to submit to peer review for a scientific journal. They have to go through a whole bunch of hoops and provide all sorts of supporting information other than just the PDF of their paper. That's another form. It's a very embedded user journey they have to go through. So over all the years of working with these sorts of systems, we've always been sort of caught in two very, very different worlds. There's always been tools like SurveyMonkey that are really excellent at very simple forms. So you get a nice little UI, you can drag and drop some fields on a page, you can do that with a very low skill base. You don't need to be a developer to build that, and that's great. So it's almost like the Excel of the online form world. So you don't need a huge expensive dev team to do this. And that's brilliant. And that solves a whole bunch of classes of problems for you really well. But also, as Werner says, there are also other types of user journey where that's not appropriate. If you presented a SurveyMonkey tool to an author of a scientific paper, they'd look quite weirdly at you and go, hang on a minute, is this for real? It was just some phishing email I just had instead. This can't be right. So your tool has to be appropriate. But there does seem to be a massive gap between these consumer-facing tools that give you sort of either no-code or low-code ways to build 80% of the sorts of user journeys that you want, and the full-on bespoke experience of a passport application journey. There's a massive gap there, and so that's really what we found is. So for example, I was working as a developer associate of Equal Experts at the Home Office, here in the UK, and just looking at and we saw firsthand just how difficult it was for them to build all of these new digital services as quickly as they needed to. So they'd got a huge variance in the sorts of problems they needed to solve. So some were literally as simple as, I want to raise a complaint because this service wasn't very good. So that's 6 fields, it sends an email, job done. Others were literally, I need to apply for a passport, or I need to apply for a visa to visit the UK. There's a big, full-on, national scale, high-profile digital services, and everything else in between. So they had got some tooling that could knock out these very simple forms, admittedly badly, but everything else was a full bespoke delivery team to do every single one, and that's horrendously expensive. If you're sitting there on the budget department of this thing, and it's a firearms license, it's a couple of fields, but it's an important service, but it's not very complicated, but it does have to be up on Gov.uk, it has to look right, so it can't have a commercial company's name on that anywhere, because it's a government service. So what you're left with a full 6-team project doing a bespoke software build. That's great. They can do that in a couple of months. They then move on to the next one, spending a couple of months on that. And before you know it, you've got an estate of over 100 separate web apps, all running, all built by slightly separate teams, all in slightly different ways. And the operations team is left with this lot going, what on earth are we supposed to do with this lot? Patch Wednesday comes along. So if you've seen the thing about the sudo exploit that's been making all the splashes today, great. All you have to do is go and patch all of your Linux servers. Go. And you've got 100 forms with 100 separate web apps on, say, 200 different servers. That's going to be fun. So there has to be a better way than this, and there has to be a way of pulling out the commonalities of these difficult bespoke journeys without having to resort to a full-on bespoke build. So that's where the idea of UXForms came from. So the consumer-facing end of the market is really well served. There's some excellent tools there, and they're really cheap, and you're not going to do anything revolutionary different there. You can do a better mousetrap, and that's cool, and one of them is going to turn up sooner or later, shortly, but it's essentially a solved problem by now. The enterprise space, really much less so. So we did this thing, like Werner's saying, of looking around at the market to see what we could find. And we really couldn't find anything on the market at all that would solve these 2 very specific problems. So if you're an organization that cares enough about your online presence, that you have to have complete control over essentially the payload. So what the form looks like, how it behaves, what the HTML and CSS and JavaScript is going to be, then that immediately cuts out, say, 80% of the tools on the market, because they don't give you that degree of control. Then the other piece that these sorts of organizations also need to do is hard integration. So integration with private bespoke backend systems that nobody's seen outside that organization before. So of course you can imagine government departments, they've got literally hundreds of private tools, workflow tools, administrative tools that have been built over the decades and are running all of the really important day-to-day operational business of these departments. If you go to pick survey tool number 26 and look at their pre-built integrations list, of course that tool is never going to be there, because how could it be? So if you then start to say, well, actually, hang on a minute, so then the people building the forms also need to be able to build their own integrations as well, that then cuts out the rest of the market, as far as we could tell. So having a forms tool that takes all the grunt work away, all the stuff like persistence to the database, mangling the HTTP payload into something that you can recognize into form fields, applying the validation as and when you should do, keeping track of each individual user's progress through the form and making sure they get asked the next question at the right time. All of that stuff is just boring, tedious, technical work that needs to be done. It's expensive, And although it sounds as though it's not difficult, you always get it a bit wrong. So you end up with large amounts of testing having to go into that, a bunch of different iterations to go through that. By the time you found a corner case in your logical flow, you do that all over again. So even with the best in the world, with the best developers in the world, it's still risk. You're still building something new for the very first time. And we have to accept that that's what bespoke development means. Every project that we do is a risky project. We're always all doing this stuff for the first time. So that's the approach, about finding some way of cutting that problem space down into, leaving the interesting bits alone. So what are the interesting bits of a form? Well, they're, what questions do I want to ask? How do I want to ask them? How can I make sure that the person filling them in has done so correctly or correctly enough? And what can I do with their answers once they've been put into that form? So once you put in the bespoke front end and the ability to integrate with literally any system that's addressable across the internet, then you have a very, very powerful tool set. So if I just want to start quickly showing some of the things that combination of behaviors makes possible. So bring this up. So this is one of our live services that's running on UXForms. So this is with the Intellectual Property Office, UK government department that looks after trademarks, Kev mentioned at the start of the call. So this is the live service for applying to register a trademark. It's an incredibly complicated user journey. I think the last time I looked at it, it had a cyclomatic complexity of something like 60, and the flow through the different screens within the form is horrendous. It's all sorts of forward and back logic. Your journey, the questions that you see when you go forwards through the form are not in the same order as the questions that you see if you want to go back through the form, back where you came from. It's a very, very complicated user journey. It costs them a lot of money to build this the first time around before we then put it onto UXForms. So that's just one thing. So there's no hint that this is a UXForms thing. This is purely governmental service. But because you then get the complete control over the payload, your forms can look like literally anything you want. So this is a little form that we knocked up for one of Equal Experts' other business practices. We chose to put a logo on because we did it as a freebie for this other department. It doesn't have to be there, like you can see. So again, a very, very different flavor of form. Or even if you get through to something like this, is a demo that we knocked up for the Abu Dhabi judicial department about raising a claim against an employer. The point where we've got little things like we've got some conditional behavior about whether you've got a lawyer or not, you have to put an address in, but also starts to show off some of the other benefits you get from using an already built platform. So for instance, we can support internationalization out of the box. So that's the same form instance in flight. All you have to literally do is supply a translation of the copy, and then UXForms takes care of the rest. In the same way that UXForms takes care of persisting stuff to the database, it takes care of putting the right text in the right places. It does all of that. But then also, once you start to talk about some more interesting user journeys, they could be around making use of these data integrations. So we made sure that you could put an integration hook literally at every place in that user journey. And so you can implement in code to implement literally anything you can think of. So it's just code. So you can make calls out to remote services in whatever way that remote service can support. So in this case, in order to even just render this view, so this is a live form in UXForms, again running with the Intellectual Property Office. This has performed a SOAP call back to their private SOAP services that happen to be built in .NET. It's understood that payload response and transformed that response into a set of common UI components that the IPO themselves have built in UXForms in order to render this response. So we can click through to one of these results and see what the authoritative URL of a trademark in the UK looks like if it wasn't for the service looking a little bit slow at the moment, which is the joy of live demos. But the idea is that because we can pull data in from anywhere, you can get any data in or out. And so then the sorts of journeys that you're able to build start to become right up that end of before you would have to build a bespoke platform from scratch because you had no option. Now with something like UXForms, you have another option, so another tool that can handle the sorts of complexity that's the sort of things that enterprises deal with day in, day out. So I also then wanted to look at what are the other sorts of things that you typically need in these sorts of tools. So to build up these sorts of user journeys. So you typically look at things like branching and conditional logic, which is normally based on previous answers to other questions. So if you answered yes to this question, then instead of jumping to section 7, you just get presented the next question immediately. You don't know that you've been sent down the other leg of the trousers in that journey. Okay, so let's take this form's back again now. Here we are. So we can see again, so cool, all the different trademarks registered by Equal Experts. We can click through to yet another form. So this is now the authoritative URL of Equal Experts for their registered logo, which is quite cute. So yeah, so you can start to build very, very complex journeys, especially when you start to bring these together. So if you could imagine a whole section within a form, say, but that section's only brought into scope. It should only be asked based on some conditions. So those conditions could be answers to previous questions, or it can be a call out to a remote system. So you can have a rules engine sitting in your estate somewhere that's responsible for making those sorts of calls, and you can make the form do its branching and conditional logic based on that on that remote rules engine that's managed a completely different way. And because everything's API based, it's all about playing nicely in the sorts of enterprise ecosystems that we expect to be building traditionally bespoke services in. So you can make calls out, you can make calls in, we can build very, very complex journeys with that. The other major criteria, again, like Werner sort of touched on, is around who your user base is and what capabilities they have. So again, the UK government has done some excellent research into that. This GovUK theme that you're looking at, what the recognizable gov.uk styling is the result of hundreds of man years of effort into exactly that question, and they've come up with a set of very, very good rules and guidelines for what services need to be able to do and how they need to work in order to support the full breadth of digital users in the UK. And some of these rules are very, very simple, but again trip up a huge tool set. So for instance, you can't use JavaScript, or at least you can use JavaScript, but can only ever be used as progressive enhancement. So that means all of the UI toolkits that all of the cool kids use these days are out. There's no React app for you. You can't use it. It's not allowed, unless you can prove with user research that your particular set of user cohort has got those. Anyway, so that's. But essentially, general rule of thumb: the service has to work without JavaScript enabled. So again, big limiting technical factor. Throws out a lot of tools, throws out a lot of tool sets and technology sets. UXForms has been built explicitly to be able to handle that. So what does that mean? How does it really work? So UXForms is a hosted, managed, multi-tenant forms platform. So it's already live, it's already up and running, it's already been pen tested, it's already on the various government procurement frameworks. So all of those other barriers that you've got for building new services or even just migrating services, there's path to live, the CI deployment, the infrastructure scripting, all of that's now just a solved problem. That's not on your project roadmap at all. That's just done. Instead, you can build forms in a almost like a DSL lightweight language that lets you focus purely on those core things that we said that you need to do. So we can have a look at an example of a form running here. So this is a demo that we built for the Canadian government. We were speaking to a little while back about their passport renewal journey, and so what that might look like. So again, it's a straightforward form journey. That's only this part. It's got some conditionality and stuff, but that's all fine. But what does that look like? So we come into the form. We've got some access control on it because we chose to put that on there. Now we're in. So the idea of this is that what does defining a form look like, and how simple can that be? And let's look at that. So this literally, these 4 lines here are all you need to write in order to make this entire page work. That gets you a production-ready, battle-hardened, live service that asks these 4 questions in a way that just works. So we have a UI component called an input text. You give it a name to associate the answer that someone gives. We've got some messages, which is a properties bundle, so all the text that gets applied to that. And then in this case, we've got some validation constraints. So that the field is required and that the answer has got a maximum length of 255 characters. And that's literally it. Absolutely everything else about keeping track of the user journey, about getting the cookies right, about getting the HTTP headers right, about getting the security, about getting the caching, about getting the persistence, about user tracking, everything else is just done. So that's literally all you have to write. So if we decided that actually this form's not great, asking you about someone's surname before their forenames is a bit weird, say, then we can just change that. So let's swap those 2 things around. So given name onto surname, go into our build tool, redeploy that form. So it's going to, in this case, it's going to delete the version that was there before, rebuild a new one, deploy it via APIs into this running platform, refresh the page, and then the given name is now the first question that we're asking instead of the last one. And again, the platform takes care of upgrading your form live as people are filling it in. So you can even add new questions to your form that are mandatory, they must complete, into a form and deploy it live whilst people are using it. And UXForms will take care of managing those user journeys to make sure that they also then complete that new data that was just essentially thrown on them whilst they were halfway through filling the form in. Again, so it's all of these sorts of sort of wizened, battle-hardened behaviors that, certainly in my experience, no project team thinks of at the start when they talk about, well, it's just a form, isn't it? We can just throw a couple of fields together in web framework of choice and it will just work. And it's really cheap and we can then just go home. Well, actually you can't. Not by the time you've started to look at all the other things that you need around it to make sure that this is a fully rounded production service. Even simple things like, what happens if the form is down? What page are you going to show then? How are you going to handle that? So all of those behaviors are already in and done. And one of the most important things I want to show, just to round this off, is that because you've got UXForms handling this user interaction for you, UXForms can also automatically capture metadata about those interactions. So in this case, we've been looking at, so these are all the different forms that we've got deployed to UXForms. So we can have a look, in this case, at the metadata for this particular form. In which case, we're not got a lot here, because it's just a little demo environment. But for instance, we can see the sorts of data that we capture automatically, which lets your user research team drill down into how your entire cohort of people is experiencing your form live. So this then can give them real data to say, hang on a minute, we're seeing this given name question, that's tripped up a whole load of validation failures. That means a whole bunch of people have either not understood the question or they've put a wrong answer in there somehow, which they've not understood it properly. So that's going to be quite a good candidate to focus our research efforts on next, as to make this question better. You know, do we want to reword it? Do we want to use a different type of UI component to get them to fill this in somehow? Is there something different we can do here? And then the real kicker is, when you deploy a new version of this form, you then start capturing that real data. And so again, for sort of enterprise scale services, typically you've got, you can do user research with 5, 10, 15, 20 people sometimes. Then it starts to get a bit hairy to get sort of good, useful face-to-face information back. But if your service is being used by 20 million people, the statistical significance of your findings is going to be, shall we say, quite a low number. So you can back up your in-person findings, or even just the best educated guess of your team's findings to make the change. Doesn't matter how you make the change. With the real data back, is this actually working in practice for everybody? And you can use that to inform your cycles about improving your service for end users, which then means that you can be really informed about how well your service is behaving and what you can do to make it better, which is one of the key things for all of us. Kev, how's that for time? I think that feels like close to a 20-minute talk.
Yeah, we got 7. That was really good, Martin. Thank you for that. Thank you both actually for a really sort of interesting, informative talk there. I think we've got sort of 50 minutes left for questions. So I'll start straight away with them. And the first one's from Christian. It's for Werner. Talking clients out of using the tool we've built sounds a bit non-productive. As someone already in a talk with us is clearly searching for a solution. How soon in the discussion should we presume that a client does not need our product and take action, send them to other providers without risking chasing away an absolute valid customer?
Yeah, it's a very counterintuitive statement to make. So I understand the question. It really comes down to knowing your own product really well. If you know your own product really well and you understand the problem domain that the customer is sitting in, it's really not hard for you to see that what this solution is that they're seeking, your product might, in most likelihood, be overkill. So there's a major difference between not having the right solution for them and having a solution that is completely overboard. So those are two different scenarios you have to deal with. But in both, the case stays the same. The moment you start to realize that, in effect, you're either going to be taking someone's money and giving them something that they don't need, or you're going to be taking someone's money and not giving them what they actually need, that would be a very good time to disengage. My personal experience on this has been that most customers actually appreciate this very much, and it creates a relationship. That's really what it comes down to, is it creates a lot of trust with a client when you're willing to do something like that, because they're not stupid. And this is a mistake that many businesses make. Customers aren't dumb. They know what's going on, and they understand that you pointing them in another direction or suggesting a solution that might be far, far, far less expensive than what you're offering right now is taking money out of your pocket. The inverse of that is also true. At some point, someone's going to look at this that's not you and tell that customer, I don't know who sold this to you, but they took you for a ride. And the basis of our decision making was always, how much reputational damage can we suffer from doing this as a fallback? But the primary question was always, are we doing the right thing for the right reason? And that's a very subjective question, or a very subjective set of questions to ask yourself. But that's pretty much how I would base it on, is, am I giving you the right thing for what you need, or am I giving you something that won't do what you actually need from it? I hope that answers the question. Christian, you're more than welcome to ping me again if you'd like some more info.
Have you got any thoughts on that, Martin, from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, so again, so over the years, we've all worked with either product companies or consultancies who've come down on the other side of that answer. They know that they've not been a good fit, and they've gone and sold in either expensive products or expensive people anyway. And eventually it goes south. Their name becomes severely tarnished. They get a really bad reputation, and everybody around the industry knows how they behave. And the names go around. So if you know a particular consultancy is on a project or doing a particular gig, you already know how well that's going to be going. You will know that they'll have overpromised themselves in, and then at some stage will be that awful dawning realization on the client going, hang on a minute, I'm paying all this money and that's not actually solving my problem. So yeah, the same thing as Werner. To be everybody really accepts and is delighted by the answer of this isn't the problem for us. And what you're doing is you're not, and because it's not your problem to solve, you're not actually giving them to a competitor. So we have this all the time. So people want, a contact us form on a website. That's not what UXForms is for. Great, use an embedded form from your CMS, or do a quick survey that you're going to do for 5 minutes and throw away later. Great, use SurveyMonkey. We're not losing business because of that, because it's not a good fit. We're helping people solve their problems, and because we understand the problem space, it's a very quick decision. We've not lost weeks of project time on it.
Brilliant. Well, seeing as you
Sorry, can I add one thing to that? There is also something else to be said for the kind of industry that the client is from. I don't know the UK that well, but for example, banking in South Africa is a really small community, and they move around tremendously fast. So you'll have an employee that works for Bank A, and in 6 months' time, they're with Bank B. So if you mess up with a client at one bank, your name travels without even interacting with the other banks real quick. And that's something else to take into consideration, is just, look, where does this client come from? And what industry are they in? And if I don't service them well, how badly am I damaging myself in the rest of that industry? Tight industries they're very dangerous places to be in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, I'm done.
Yeah, I suppose do the right thing is a take-home message for them to answer. So Martin, the second question, does UXForms allow platform users, not platform builders, to create their own forms for distribution? Or is the form controlled only to be the enterprise platform builders for internal use? That's from Paul.
I may not have quite understood the question. So if you're asking about what sort of skills do you need to build forms, is that around the idea that sort of can end users or sort of...
Paul's just followed up. For context, we're form builders ourselves, but haven't stretched it as far as an easily configurable and widely distributable survey tool for our users to control themselves.
Oh, okay. So what we found is that there's a real trade-off here. So the sorts of tooling that you can build to let non-technical people build forms places a whole bunch of restrictions on how much power that tool can have and the expressiveness of that tooling. So it's great for being able to quickly visualize what questions, what order, and what they look like. It's really good. But when it comes to say complicated logic as to whether one question should appear or not, it becomes very hard to visualize that in such a tool. And then when you start to get really complicated, like custom UI components from scratch, how do you drop them into like a sort of visual tool? So we thought long and hard about this, because of course everybody wants everything. I want to be able to quickly drag and drop stuff and make this stuff easy and have it really easy for non-technical people to build this stuff, but I also want the full expressiveness of being able to build literally anything I want to anyway. And those two don't meet. You can't have both. I would dearly love to be able to, and if you can find a way of doing it, let me know. But we've not solved it. We've seen UI builders in IDEs try and solve this problem, and they always go wrong. Eventually, the draggy droppy bit gets out of sync with the code that's trying to be synced behind. You get the right mess, and you've got to delete the project from scratch and start all over again. It always goes wrong. So the tooling is about your audience, and that's a combination of the power and expressibility that the tool needs, and the sorts of customers that are going to use such a thing. And you have to find the sweet spot that works for that specific audience between those two vectors.
Thanks, Martin. I think the next question from Peter is, how is UXForms priced? But I'll probably, after you've answered it, open it up to both of you to just talk a little bit and get your thoughts on how web form builders, what the different pricing models are and what you think is a good example of one. So first to you, Martin, UXForms, how is it priced in basic?
Yeah, so it's priced on a subscription model. So the idea is that, again, there's no upfront fees, there's no setup costs. It's literally just subscribing for the use of the product. And we've got a couple of tiers on that for usage bandings. But again, because we're at the enterprise scale, we're mostly in the space of talking to specific clients about the use that they need. So if you try and imagine sort of one pricing model to rule them all for For somewhere that's got 800 forms and they're all incredibly trivial and don't get used very much, or 2 forms, horrendously complicated, and they get 8 million requests a day. How can you come up with one pricing model to solve those 2 cases when you can't really? So really, when it comes down to this sort of scale for these sorts of things, it always comes down to the conversation about what we need to make it work and what they see the value of the product as bringing to them.
Okay. And Werner, we've got about 8 minutes left, but before we answer Abdul's question next, have you got any thoughts on the pricing models for web form builders?
Yeah, so for me, it's always been it's actually a very simple piece of math. Is depending on which tool you're buying, you need to understand how much volume you're going to be pushing in a certain time frame. Let's call it a month. So it's unwise to subscribe for a top tier in a tool if you're not going to be pushing the volume that justifies being at that top tier. Now, a lot of people would buy top tier in order to have the customizability, but that's not necessarily the right decision to make if you're going to be renting something. You need to look at your volumes. If I'm doing 4 or 5 surveys a month, being in top tier in a tool is not the smartest thing I can do. So it really is about how much volume am I pushing, and because you have to carry that cost over to a customer, right? Let's just be fair here. This cost is going to be carried over into the invoice. So how much am I going to have to bloat that invoice to cover my top tier rental for 5 customers? And then next month, when there's 15 customers and one of them come back, the pricing might change, or I might just keep on billing everyone at this insanely high rate. And then you lose customers because someone else is using exactly the same tool. They just didn't go top tier and they're coming in cheaper than you. So it really is a volume versus tier question for me if you're going to be renting. If you're building yourself, best to have the volume to cover your build and maintenance cost.
Definitely. Brilliant. Coming back to that old adage of do the right thing again, I suppose, for the client. So that's good. Okay, so Abdul's question was, I might have missed it from Martin's talk, but can you confirm if UXForms have callbacks?
Hey, Abdul. So yeah, all the integration hooks are actually driven by the user journey. So it's when you move from one question to the next, or one page to the next, or there's a particular user interaction with it, even a specific UI component, that then triggers the integration hook. And that integration hook can just be implemented in code. And so everything is driven that way. So yeah, there's no really such thing as a callback into a form instance, because then you get into the fun and games about, okay, how do I know whose form instance am I mucking with? And that can get a bit interesting to make sure that you get that. So if you get that wrong, you've just opened a massive can of worms about the security of the data that you're holding on people's behalf.
Brilliant. And the second question is, how do you handle load as a service? For instance, we work with university students, and the heavy usage at specific times, such as towards the end of term or the start of the academic year. Does the clients of UXForms have to plan for fixed capacity?
No, they don't. We again, we go into that conversation about what do they need. So we have a shared expectation about what it is that they've bought and what we're providing. But in terms of platform, it auto scales. I mean, so this has been built after umpteen grizzled years of building stuff at EE and beyond. And so, yeah, everything's automated, everything's scripted, all the infrastructure is configured to scale and shrink at runtime. So new forms are deployed into infrastructure at runtime and deleted again at runtime. So yeah, everything is auto scaling, auto shrinking in response to live load.
Brilliant. And we've got 3 quick fire questions. We've got sort of a few minutes left. So if we can just give very short answers, and I'll just sort of summarize and close the meeting. So a question submitted from someone prior to the call. How much would you recommend try before you buy, Martin?
Assuming we've gone past those first conversations where we still think it's a good fit and the right thing to do, it's absolutely critical. And so we think it's so important that, for instance, the subscription fee for using UXForms does not become chargeable until your service is live. It's that important. So you can do your alphas and your betas and try stuff out and do all sorts of user research, and that can go on for months, and that's cool. But you're only getting the value from the platform once it's live, and only then do we start charging you.
Thank you. You only need to build what's valuable. How do you keep that on track, Martin?
Well, there's two questions there, isn't there? So valuable in terms of what you need in the user journey, or valuable in terms of the tool. In terms of the user journey, that's a nice, easy question in theory. That's just how do you work out what your product is? You need to go out. Again, answers are going to be different for different size projects and teams and services. But yeah, you make your best decisions about what to add to your service. In terms of product, we have to be extremely aggressive about what the product's for, but more interesting, what the product is not for. And be really hard-nosed about saying, that's lovely. I can think of all sorts of really good reasons for why you want this thing, but that's not what UXForms is for, so we're not going to do it. So yeah, we have some very hard discussions sometimes about, no, we're not going to do that. That's not what we're about. Because you have to keep scope nailed, if nothing else, for us to be able to even maintain what we've built already, and for people to understand what it is that we do.
Thank you. And last question, you might be covering this, but how do you build in design? Martin.
Build in design. So with my hard-nosed, it's not my feature hat on, I don't. So UXForms is an enabling tool. It lets you do the design, but it does not force our ideas of what good design is on users of the tooling. So I have UX people come to me quite regularly and say, this pattern of a single question per page is really important. All our research says that's the right thing to do. So it'd be great if your tool would stop people adding more than one question to a page. The answer is, well, no, we're not going to do that. You can enforce those rules on your team. That's great, do that. But as a tool, we've got to be open and flexible to handle those corner cases. So there will always be a condition that you need to break the rules. And if the tool doesn't let you do that, then the tool won't work for you. So we need to allow the design to be in the hands of the people using the tool, rather than us forcing our ideas of what it should be on them.
Perfect. Thank you, Martin. So that brings the meeting to a close. Just got to do a couple of things before we finish. The first one is to thank both Werner and Martin for their time and insight and answer. So thank you from Equal Experts. And the second thing is to thank everybody who attended and listened to the talk. And just to remind everybody, our next expert talk online is the 10th of February. It's by Dave Farley, who's the founder and director of Continuous Delivery Limited. He's a regular conference speaker, YouTuber, and widely read blogger on technology and software. And the title of that talk is Lessons from the Cyberpunk 2077 release. So that explores how we should be engineering in software terms and why it matters. So with that, just like to thank everybody for attending, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.